When you have these sources of inspiration coming in, how do you gather your thoughts and decide on a narrative for a product? You mentioned you have Post-its all over the place. Do you have those for the storytelling? Do you have like a whiteboard where you just write stuff? What does it look like? Like if we were to shadow you as you're coming out with the story for a product, what would we see?
Well, I always try and think about what the consumer or the reader is going to want to know about. There are tons of things that I could throw at a writer to then throw at the consumer, or to try and get them to buy the product and all that. But I think it's really important to, from the PR side of things and communicating to a journalist, I never want to overwhelm a person. I want to get them the exact, like, I try and keep things to kind of like a 3-bulleted list, like this is what you need to know and why. But I always try and think of the consumer. That's honestly all I wanted to think about, because at the end of the day, and especially in modern days, it's just about sell. That's just one angle, I should say. And another point, there are more brand narratives, which, that's a little different in terms of the creativity process, depending on, what you're working on, who you're working with, and the brand and what they want to communicate. But if you were to shadow me, you would see a lot of Post-its, a lot of tabs open, because I have to read a lot of news. I have to keep up with who's writing what their opinions are, if they've shifted their beat at all, if they stopped writing, if they moved to freelance, which in the past year we've seen a lot of, which is, there's pros and cons. A lot of publishers have had to shift and people have gone freelance. So I try to read as much as I can. I try to keep up on any sort of new strategic PR opportunities. So for instance, in the last few years, we've seen such a great rise in digital newsletters, from things like The Skim to Morning Brew. So I'm always trying to think of, okay, I wouldn't have ever really thought about this, but the Morning Brew is essentially, it's a digital outlet. Like if we have something that comes out that relates to them, I should be pitching them. And I think, 3-4 years ago, that wasn't on the top of everyone's mind, maybe for something more business related and finance related. But now that's like where a lot of people get their news, and people are just inundated with so much news. So I'm always trying to think of new modern media approaches, like a podcast, and how we can get our storytelling out.
I was especially impressed with the Hasan Minhaj sneaker line, because there was a content element to it as well. You sent someone out to, I believe it was Davis or Sacramento, where he was at, where he grew up with his family, and actually recorded videos and followed him in very sentimental places in his life. And how do you think about the strategy when it comes to collaborations, and how much Cole Haan should get into content directly? What are those kinds of considerations? Like, you can talk about it generally, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I can't take credit for that video, but that video was really meaningful and impactful. I know it meant a lot to him. I will say, for collaborators, it's always really important. And I used to deal with this from agency side as well. It's really important to get the collaborator's point of view. You don't want something, if it's like the leading brand, to take something might say, blank X blank, but you want it to be cohesive. You don't want that one leading title to be the owner. You want it to be very natural and organic. So I always hold a meeting where we just ask people for their background and ask people why this is meaningful to them, what their design inspiration was, what are the key elements. I mean, the Hasan one's a great example. I mean, he really incorporated so many personal elements literally into the shoes, like wove details into the shoes. So I think it's just really important to always keep that in mind. We really try to kind of keep a personal lens on things, because at the end of the day, I mean, specifically at Cole Haan, and this doesn't apply to everything, but like you mentioned, so Cole Haan can be the shoes your dad wore, but it also can be the shoes you wore to prom or your graduation. And it's very intergenerational. So it's really nice to have those really personal, familial, if possible, narrative tie-ins to provide media. And I think the media responded really well to that in that circumstance. Collaborations, brands do all the time, and in some instances don't come off as organic or as a right fit. So I think it's just really important that when brands do collaborate, brands across the gamut, like not even just in fashion and lifestyle, but in every aspect, I just think it's always really important that there's that like really natural sensibility to it.
That's awesome. And it makes me think of, specifically in the case of that sneaker line, I remember him saying that he had this one pair of sneakers or shoes rather, that he wore to his Daily Show audition. He wore to all these memorable events in his life. And it was really cool how it was all timed in. Before we get into rapid fire questions, I want to ask, through your PR experience, have you seen anything that you think is especially unique to standing out in the fashion landscape? I know you've had experience with different kinds of companies, but it seems like fashion is at a really interesting juncture right now, especially with the rise of e-commerce, which I think is awesome because it allows consumers like me to more easily get your products and enjoy them. At the same time, I think it can be hard to stand out when there's TikTok and Snap and Twitter and Facebook and all these different outlets to reach a customer like me. So how have you found with fashion in particular that you're able to stand out as so many things are changing in the landscape?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I don't always like to use the word fashion just because I even think growing up in LA or, or not, I used to live in New York, fashion can sometimes have like a negative connotation to it or snooty or exclusive. So I always like to think about that I do PR and we represent a lifestyle brand. So I mean, this is again very specific to Cole Haan, but I think if I were to go beyond somewhere, I wouldn't want to be a publicist for a brand or that doesn't provide some sort of benefit to my day-to-day, to be completely honest. I think the way we all engage with brand like DTC brands on their websites or when we're on social media or when we see ads in social media, I personally resonate with things that, maybe it's like a style that I might wear, but I personally resonate to the messaging that I think is impactful. So whether it's something that relates to my career and my personal life or like sustainability, the things that I have like values in, I think that is the most important. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's kind of where I diverged.
Yeah, absolutely.
And PR is, sometimes has a negative connotation to it. Like I mentioned at the beginning, like people think of the word spin and like PR stunt and things like that. But I really think that with really, like I mentioned, consumer minded strategies and at this point in time, DTC, e-com focused strategies that really convey honesty and like have a relatability component, people will resonate with that and they'll go to your site and maybe they won't buy something, but they'll think about you the next time they're ready to buy something.